Hi, folks. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Conservation. In this episode, we've got a very special guest. We're doing another expert interview. And just a quick recap on some of the other previous episodes we've done. So it's another continuation on the lime series we've been doing. So we've covered the lime cycle. We've covered some building and pointing mortars. We've covered plastering, rendering. We've even spoken to Steve Hogarth last time about the high level stuff that we've got on buildings. And this episode, we've got a special guest to talk to us about more internal plasterwork, specifically on ceilings. Here we go. Hello and welcome to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
With me, Rich Aylesbury.
And me, Stephen Boniface. So this evening we're talking to Sean Wheatley. Now, I've known Sean for quite a few years because we've been privileged to have Sean speaking at the summer school. So a quick plug for the summer school there. But Sean's been one of our lecturers and he helps run the Lime Day for us. Now, Sean is a seasoned heritage plasterer. Now, let me get this right. He's a master plasterer. I'm not quite sure. Sean, you can tell us in a minute exactly what your titles are. But am I right in thinking, Sean, that you started off as just a conventional plaster doing the same old job as everyone else? Or were you always interested in conservation?
No, I started my plastering journey in 1978. My gymnastics coach was a plasterer, and when I was tall enough or strong enough to be carrying buckets and the like, holidays, weekends was pocket money. And at the end of that, when I finished school, I left school at 15. I wanted to be a motor mechanic. I couldn't get an apprenticeship in 1981, so I became a plasterer with Jeff, who I worked with for 10 years. I've been self-employed since the day I left school, never been employed. And he was a very fine tutor, a wonderful man, still is. And he taught me plastering. And yes, the first 10 years of my plastering career was new builds, extensions, barn conversions, and anything plaster related. I worked in Germany from 92 to 93. When I came back from Germany, I was plasterboarding ceilings on a National Trust property. And the surveyor came in and said, "What do you know about laths and lime and traditional plasterwork?" I said, "Well, I know that no one does it anymore." And he said, "Well, I've got a SPAD magazine. And there's a course advertised up in Oxford, which was through IJP Building Conservation, Ian Pritchett. So my dad, my first apprentice, we signed up on the course and off we went. When we got there, Ian Pritchett came over and we had our T-shirts on. And he said, "It's a little bit embarrassing. My plasterer hasn't turned up today. Would you mind demonstrating how long you've been plastering?" I said, 11 years now. "But I don't understand lime or laths or whatever it is. That's what I've come to learn." He said, "I understand the chemistry. I explain that, the whys and the wherefores. If you can just apply it to some panels, we'll get on famously." And we did. I had a wonderful day, back in the day of writing letters rather than emails. Explained that I'd had a great day and would like to learn more. And if they had any projects where they think they might be able, I might be able to come along, which we did. I think it was 6 weeks later, I went up for 6 weeks at the Henry Box School in Witney, chopping off hard sand, cementitious renders, and reapplying lime mortars and rough casting. And then about a year after that, we went up to Althorpe. Princess Diana passed away, and we worked there for 10 weeks converting the stable block into a museum for her dresses and history of her life. And that was 10 weeks of laths, lime, running cornice in situ. It was wonderful. And we went on then to various other projects for about another 8 months, I think, before I had to come home, working away Monday to Friday. But it was and I worked with some wonderful plasterers, long since retired now, who were more than happy to show me how to run cornice, how they did it, the recipes they used, passing on their knowledge. It was invaluable, really. And that's what I like to try and do now.
So am I right in saying, though, that in recent years you've been honoured in being accepted into is it the guild, the livery? What is it? Tell us more about that.
I was asked to give a talk online during COVID. The master, which was Margaret Coates at the time, the master changed every year, for the Worshipful Company of Plaisterers. They were given their royal charter in 1501 by Henry VII and have been going strong ever since. They're one of the great guilds, one of the 111 or 113 guilds in the City of London, city and guilds. And they came about by trying to set a standard that all plasterers should follow. So they're the Worshipful Company of Plaisterers. I gave a talk, a Zoom meeting on 2 of our projects with slideshows. I thoroughly enjoyed it and it went down very well. And Margaret Coates asked me to apply to become a freeman of the Worshipful Company of Plasterers, which I did, and I was accepted. And then in 2022, I became a master plasterer of the Worshipful Company of Plasterers, which means you have to have 20 years behind you and a portfolio of projects from start to finish. They go through it in depth to make sure that you are part of the project from start to finish. And 2022, 4th of March, went to the Mansion House in City of London, was presented my Master Plasterer certificate by Vincent Keaveney, who was at that time Lord Mayor of London. A wonderful day, an amazing ceremony, and just really, really proud to be a part of it, to be perfectly honest. It was, for me, that was the height of my achievements, I think.
Well, and the projects that you've done, because I've had the privilege of seeing you talk through some of those projects, and as we'll come on to, it is genuinely staggering. I mean, sometimes some of the listeners on here might be thinking, oh, Plaster's just making a wall flat, but as we'll come into, the type of detail that you go into in terms of the ornate plaster work, that's on another level, which is incredible, and I'm looking forward to going into that.
Thank you. And in the last 20 years, I've put 8 apprentices through college with the CITB, some help from the CITB. And up until 2022, all 8 apprentices had more qualifications in plastering than I did. So, and this week, we have just signed up Dexter Sanders, who's 17, and he starts college in September. So he'll be my 9th apprentice. I employ 3. Dominic, I've employed for 20 years. Dan, I've employed 19 years. And Jamie has been employed, it'll be 5 years in October. So Jamie was our last apprentice. The difficulty is in the Southwest, there are no colleges within 120 miles that are tutoring plastering. So Dexter is now going to go down to Plymouth 2 days a month, Monday and a Tuesday, to a training provider to gain his qualifications. But the bulk of the tutoring and everything will be done on site by us. But I do feel very proud.
I think it's brilliant what you've done, and getting the next generations of plasterers through is fantastic. You've alluded to the fact that you're in the Southwest, but you've already mentioned Althorpe, which is obviously Northamptonshire. And so, yeah, am I right in thinking that you go anywhere so long as they pay you, or do you stick regionally?
Washington, D.C. is the furthest we've gone so far. We also work on Jersey. We worked on Jersey for the National Trust for Jersey. More recently for the same architect, but a private client on Jersey as well. So yes, we travel far and wide for our work. Predominantly the Southwest, but there are 3 projects at the moment. I live in Coomartin, which is North Devon, as do the team. This year, we've spent an awful lot of time in Airbnbs, accommodation, and hotels. But it's wonderful work. Dan and Dom thoroughly enjoy the work. Don't get me wrong; we also quite enjoy working close to home on whatever comes through the door. But I do go to them, say we've had an inquiry, show them photos that I've been sent. Would you, shall I price it? It means we're going to be away for, if we get it, 3 weeks or 3 months, whatever. Do you want to have a go at it? Yes, we do. So I'll go and price it. And if we win it, we're away. So, yeah, we travel all over. We're very lucky. We thoroughly enjoy it.
Earlier, you mentioned that you started by putting up plasterboard in, one of the jobs was plasterboard in a National Trust property, for a ceiling in a National Trust property. But as we all know, there are many different types of substrates, as it were, to ceilings. So plasterboard is a modern late Victorian onwards type stuff. I mean, I remember years ago seeing plasterboard that was thought to be from the 1870s. So we know it was being used around then anyway, although it wasn't common until later. I've also personally, I've seen reed, obviously lath and plaster, and various other bits and pieces. So can you just tell us what sort of materials you've come across over the years in your experience that people might find if they're trying to repair a ceiling and they think, good grief, what is this that I'm dealing with? What sort of things might they come across?
In Coomartin, about 12 years ago, working on a Victorian terrace, small, very humble little cottages, lovely. We was asked to come and repair a ceiling where the electrician had been in, left a floorboard up, and the homeowner had put his foot through the ceiling. Could we come and repair the patch? It was plasterboard with lime backing coats, coarse. There's coarse stuff and fine stuff. Coarse stuff is the coarser sand that you put the hair and fibres in. and the fine stuff, the finishing stuff, is the fine finishing coat. No holes drilled in the plasterboard, but they'd applied lime and sand, lime putty and sand, coarse sand with hair and fibres onto the plasterboard, and then skimmed it. Whereas we would now think a plasterboard ceiling is going to have a gypsum 3mm finishing coat, 4mm finishing coat on it. So that was interesting. Lath and plaster, as you say, sawn lath. Everything from day one, when it comes to lath and plaster ceilings, would have been riven, split by hand, the oak or chestnut, sometimes softwood. Although I've never bought or been able to find anyone that splits softwood laths now. They're always either oak or chestnut. And currently, there's a massive shortage in the UK of riven oak or chestnut laths. Early ceilings were always riven, oak, fixed or chestnut, possibly softwood, a haired pricking up coat, a haired floating coat or levelling coat, and then a very fine finishing coat on the top. 1846 is the earliest date seen in the UK for sawn laths. Obviously, sawn laths, they will go through a machine, the sawmills. We've seen sawn laths with very coarse blades. So they still give key. When riven laths split by hand, they have the sinews, if you like, of the timber. So they've got really good key for the plaster to bite onto, good gaps plaster can squeeze through to form the nibs of the keys. Sawn laths of recent years, it's almost like they've been planed. The blades they're using are super fine, and they're not great, to be perfectly honest. Judging or guessing the date or age of a ceiling, if you see it with riven laths, it goes back from day one. If you start seeing sawn laths, it's 1846 onwards or thereabouts.
Some of the people listening or watching this will have maybe a Victorian Edwardian home and want to do the right thing using lath and plaster. But when they look at the cost of riven, they say, "Oh, good grief, can't afford it." And the temptation then is just to jump straight to plasterboard. But obviously sawn laths are an option. What would be your top tips if they were to look at sawn laths to make sure they're cheaper, but to make sure they're getting a good quality lath that will work with a traditional lime plaster finish, etc.?
Sawn laths generally are less than half the price. A bundle of 4 foot, because they're sold in feet and inches, 4 foot riven oak or chestnut is around about £130 a bundle, 200 feet. Sawn laths would be less than half. So when we're pricing projects, we always make sure that the specification, if it says replace with lath and plaster, we make sure that everyone's on the same footing. We're going to be specifying and supplying riven oak laths as opposed to sawn oak, because the cost is huge. There is a young chap in South Molton, Ed the Lath, he is on my phone. He does oak lintels and the like, and he saws laths. And he has recently, they're called diamondback laths. If you Google diamondback laths, they'll come up. One side of it is this, as it comes from the sawmill or through the saw blade. The other side, I'm not quite sure how he's done it, but it's got huge, coarse saw diamond shapes that have been on a bench saw, and they're superb. And I think they're around about £60 a bundle, £65 a bundle, something along those lines.
So when you say this is for the plaster to grip onto, I mean that's what we're talking here. And is it so critical for walls as well as ceilings? I mean, I'm just thinking obviously for the weight through. I mean, is it just as important for both?
It is really. And also the spacings of the studs on the ceilings or the joists on the ceilings. Traditionally 16 inches, sometimes 18 inches. And some of the sawn laths that are being sold, they're too flexible over an 18-inch span or 450 millimetres if you like new money. They're too flexible. So sturdy oak sawn laths can be used, absolutely fine. But the diamondback ones that are now being produced are superb.
So a homeowner wanting to find these sawn laths needs to really look for ones, because not everyone will have your chap on their phone. They really need to specifically look for those that, at least on one side, have got quite a rough finish.
Yes, that would be my advice. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you can get sawn larch, which are a bit too flimsy for my liking, is the honest truth, and they're also the blades are obviously quite fine toothed. Some people use them for repairing walls. We wouldn't personally. We would go with, if we have to use sawn oak, we'd go with the sawn oak.
What about the fixings of the laths? Does that matter much? I mean, it has to be a particular type of nail, stainless.
It is quite important. Historically, some historic ceilings have failed through nail rot. The plaster and the keys are hanging perfectly to the laths, but the laths have let go from the underside of the joists because of the cast nails that they were using. If the oak was really green, the tannins would attack that and cause them to rot. So if you are seeing bowing ceilings, always find out why they're bowing and where and how they can be repaired.
So that's often the witness mark, isn't it? Certainly on an oak beam, you've got the black rings around it, of course. That's the witness mark, of course, the iron and the ferrous coming out of being attacked by the tannins. And so it's,
Yeah. So some ceilings do fail, or some, walls, lath and plaster, they do fail from nail rot. We use today traditional ye olde weldy 32mm stainless steel ring shanked headed nails with on an air nailer. It runs off a compressor. They are, as I say, stainless steel. They're ring shanked, so they've got rings all the way around them. They've got a proper head on them. They're not a brad nail like a second fix or staples. We never use staples. And they're stainless steel. They're blunt on the ends. They have a flat end to them. Years ago, they always used to come out with a point on them, and we bought a box of 16,000. I opened it up, and all the ends of the nails were absolutely blunt. I phoned up to say I think there's something gone wrong with one of the machines, or wherever you get them from. I'm not happy about this. Try them. They said just try them. And for those carpenters amongst you, that if you're fixing a fine pin nail in an architrave, you turn the nail over, blunt the end, and then put it in. And instead of the point of the nail piercing its way through, because it's blunt, it pushes its way through, so it doesn't split the grain of the timber. It's incredible. When it comes to fixing laths, on the ends, obviously, where you're joining them one to the other on a
high risk of splitting, of course, in that lath.
Exactly that. Yeah. So we use, and the air nailers we use are the impact from them. We wouldn't use it if we're repairing part of a ceiling. We'd still go with screws and washers, or stainless steel screws, pre-drill the laths, because that will split them, because we don't want any extra vibration in the ceiling. But the nailers we use today, to be honest, the impact is negligible, and it fires them straight in. It doesn't enjoy firing them into old oak timbers because they're
they're rock hard.
They're absolutely rock hard. But yeah, that's what we would use is stainless steel headed ring shank nails.
It's interesting you mentioned about blunting the ends. My grandfather was a carpenter, and he taught me to do that from a very early age. So it's one of those tricks. He used to just get a piece of concrete nearby and just knock the nail on that so the end was blunt, and then use it. And yeah, exactly as you say. So yeah, I can
I'm going to give that a go. That sounds like a great tip. Yeah, it's like a bit of split wood at the end.
Yeah. Just literally blunt the nail, and it forces its way through. It pushes its way through rather than piercing or splitting the. So that's what we use for that. Obviously, when it comes to repair and restoration and conservation, we tend to use stainless steel screws if we're replacing areas.
You talk about fixing, and one of the things you mentioned earlier was the spacings of the laths. I was always taught that basically it's about the width of your little finger or something, or at least my little finger, because everyone's got different size hands. But just talk to us about the spacing and what's the optimum spacing, what's too big, what's too small, etc., etc.
3/8 of an inch or 9mm. And the easiest way to gauge that is just to have a piece of 9mm ply and just use it, butt the lath up against it, put the nail in, butt the nail up against it. Too tighter spacings is the cause of a lot of failures historically. If the laths are too tight, you can't push the mortar through. If they're too wide, you generally just have a bit of a job getting the pricking up coat to stay up there. So yeah, width of a finger, 9mm or 3/8 of an inch is traditional gapping for the laths. But obviously with riven laths being the shape they are, really do, they take some pulling straight really. And you do need to be, the spacings on laths, unfortunately, occasionally I get called out to give opinions on why things, generally speaking, it's the laths are too close together. You have to remember some of the backing coats, the mortar we're using will have 5mm aggregate in it, 5 or 6mm. And by the time that's lime and got hair and fibres wrapped around it, you need a substantial gap to be able to push the plaster through. So yeah, 9 millimeters.
That's excellent. We'll come on to the actual plaster mix later on, but sticking with the substrates, one of the other substrates I've come across, not that frequently, but I have come across, is reed. And of course now we can get reed mat, or you used to. I'm not sure if you still can, but you used to be able to get reed mat, like a substitute for the old reed. Have you dealt with reed much, or is that something that you don't have to deal with?
Like I say, living in North Devon, the closest ceilings and walls that I repaired were earth mortar on reed, and that was down at the Holnicott Estate National Trust down near Dunster. And the reason being the sort of wash or the flat areas they have inland where the reeds grow, or it's long wheat straw, it's in abundance and you can harvest it every year. Suffolk, Lincolnshire, they have a lot of reed on the walls and ceilings, not only for vernacular buildings. 2021, we worked on Brocket Hall in Hertfordshire, I think, just outside of Welwyn Garden City. Phenomenal grade one listed building. The ceiling we worked on was the library ceiling, which was a Robert Adam ceiling, and the substrate was reed. It's a localized thing. If you have it in abundance, it would be used. And it wasn't only for vernacular cottages or farm buildings or the like. It was used wherever they had it.
Easy to work with? I mean, is it? I mean, I'm just thinking with laths. I'm just trying to think of my limited experience with a hawk and a trowel squeezing between some laths. For me, reed would just sounds like it'd be really hard to squeeze into. Is it not?
It's very flexible. So the way we go about it, we fix laths running with the joists, and we hang them down about 50 mil, and then we pack the reeds individually, or 3 or 4, whatever you can get in hand at a time, up underneath the laths until you don't really want to be able to push your hand through it with any force, but you've still got to put plaster onto it, wet plaster. So it needs to probably be 6 or 7 reeds in depth, possibly 8 reeds in depth. And then once you've got that and you've evened them out, you then finish fixing the laths up to the underside of the joist, and it's the laths that clamp them to the joists.
Gotcha.
And photos we send.
We're coming on to some like repair bits later on, but whilst we're on reed, because I don't think there'll be a huge number of people that have got a reed ceiling, how can you repair it? Like if you've got a hole in it or something, do you have to pair right back to the joist, I'm assuming, to then replace the reed? I mean,
in an ideal world, you need to pair back, take the plaster back to where it's secure, if you've got a hole in the ceiling, and we would take it back to a joist, because we need a joist for the reeds to fix to, as we would with laths. Same thing there. You wouldn't let laths float in between joists. They need to be fixed on an end. It's a wonderful material, very, very flexible. So for vernacular buildings, following the shapes of the underside of a thatched cottage or whatever, lime sticks very, very well to them, as does earth mortars. A great substrate.
Talking about substrates and moving on to the next one, we've already mentioned board and plasterboard. Are there any other types of board that people use? Or in the modern world, obviously we've got a lot of fibre board, wood fibre boards and things like that. What are your tips on using board, or if you come across old board? I'm just thinking generally. Lime presumably will work on any substrate. It doesn't matter. You can even, as you've already mentioned, you find it on plasterboard. So it will work on anything, wouldn't it? Or are there some problems with lime on some of these boards?
You've got wood wool board, which is a very open grain board, and then you've got wood fibre board. Most of those companies selling those, the manufacturers of those boards would have their own mixes, is the honest truth. And it's probably best you stick with them. Fat lime, traditional lime putty mixes will go quite well on wood wool boards. I personally wouldn't try it on wood fibre boards, because the wood fibre, it's such a dense material. And they're the ones that have their own bagged, pre-mixed mortars. You just add water and apply it, generally speaking. You can apply chalk plasters to wood fibre boards. Having said that, you can apply chalk plasters to pretty much glass, really. It sticks wonderfully to pretty much any substrate. Down here in North Devon, we don't have much in the way of chalk plasters. Devon and Cornwall have got the highest population of earth buildings, so it's either traditional lime putty mixes or earth mixes that we use down here.
When you say earth, I mean, are you literally talking about the sort of soil you get off the garden, or are you talking more like clay?
It's a mixture of subsoil and clay. You can't have just topsoil, that won't bind together. Pure clay mortar on its own is going to be extremely difficult to apply with a hawk and trowel or even by hand. So earth mortars are sort of subsoil, I think we would sort of base that on, really. Recipes are still out there. It's not a problem. We're quite blessed. There's a gentleman called Kevin McCabe who's built, I think it's 5 new build houses in Cobb, including the one that he lives in at the moment. And when we've had earth mortars specified, if it's a repair job, we've got 2 ceilings at the moment. We've managed to scrape off the paper, take the earth mortar off the ceiling, crush it up, add some quicklime, more hair, and put it back up on the ceiling, which is a win-win situation. But if we have a larger project, Kevin McCabe comes across collapsed barns, cob barns, people are phoning him up. He'll go out with a big machinery, pick it up, take it back to his yard, sieve out X amount for earth mortars or plasters, and reuse the other cob on other projects.
I mean, I love that. I mean, that's just the entire ecosystem of just the circular building materials just being reused all the time. I mean, you just simply wouldn't do that with any kind of new build at the moment, which gets flattened and demolished.
Yeah,
Maybe
exactly.
some aggregate if you're lucky, but
well, that's the best they can do, isn't it? Crush it up into aggregate on site. Whereas there's a ceiling, grade 2 start in Dartmouth that we're working on, and we managed to take down probably 14 meters that had to come down through structural repairs. They couldn't get to the structural repairs without losing part of the ceiling. We kept the mortar. We managed to clean the paint off of it before we took it down, crush it up, bit of quicklime, animal hair, and put it back on the ceiling.
wow, it's amazing.
1639.
Gosh,
it's just a win-win situation. It really,
of course it is. It really is.
Yeah. And we're working on a project at the moment near Hatherley, which was an earth ceiling. Unfortunately, it was taken down before we got there. It should have been repaired, could have been repaired. But luckily, they just piled it up in the farmyard. So I've now got about 8 or 9 rubble sacks that we've sieved out, taken off the paint or taken off the finishing coat, which we'll reuse on other projects.
Excellent. Just thinking about identifying what we've got. I mean, when you're standing under a ceiling and it's finished and you're looking up, I mean, a ceiling is a ceiling. You know, it theoretically, well, could look the same. So how would an owner of a building or someone responsible for looking after a building know what sort of ceiling they've got? What's the best way of finding out?
The age of the building will give a strong indication if it's laths or if it's plasterboard or if it's reed. If the ceiling's in good order, if you've got an option of looking at the back of the ceiling, lifting some floorboards or carefully getting up into an attic space and having a look, that's the best way of identifying it. Obviously, endoscope cameras, drilling a small hole. If we were to drill a small hole in a ceiling, we'd know from the aggregate how it was constructed. But the age of the building hopefully would give you a good indication of its construction.
Yeah, but looking at the back of it, I think is the sort of thing, lifting a floorboard or going into a roof space for most people is probably the least destructive way of finding out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to move on now to a quick fire sort of round with picking Sean's brains on what is a problem, what isn't a problem, and how you deal with it, kind of thing. I guess the first one really that comes to mind for me is cracks. And when is a crack like a serious crack versus a non-crack? And this is a crack in a ceiling, not in a joint of a wall and so forth, in terms of how can you determine and what are the things people can do to investigate whether or not that's something that needs to be repaired or something that actually you can just stick a bit of filler over the top?
Yeah, certainly. The first thing to do is identify why it's got a crack in it. Plasterwork, whether it's inside, outside, is purely decorative. It's not structural. So if you see cracks in your ceiling, the first thing to do is work out why it's cracking. If they're cracks in a long line, it's probably a weakened timber. That could be through beetle or worm infestation that's taken its toll, and all of a sudden people walking across upstairs, the joists are no longer as strong as they were. The most important thing is to identify why it's cracked, and then you can go about making repairs. If it's structural, you need to seek professional advice as to whether the joists can be sistered or flitched, or whether it's gone, rotten, damp has got one end. But generally, if you see cracks in a long straight line, that's a weakened joist. it's got more flex in it. If you see diagonal cracks running through a ceiling, that, in my experience, is generally a structural issue with the building. If you see, running across at weird angles, 2 or 3 of them, that means that something has moved and caused it. Most cracks will run along the line of a joist, one way or another. Like I say, always identify, find out why it's cracked, and then many ways of successfully repairing it if it can be repaired. Whether it's, I'm not a big fan when you see cracks making them any bigger or running a knife through them. If they are historic plasterwork, the older the plasterwork, the more hair you'll find in it. 1600s, 1700s, vast amounts of hair. 1800s onwards, not so much. 13th, 14th century, 15th, huge amounts of animal hair and fibres, like we have here. Cow body hair was traditionally used. It's a byproduct of the meat industry. Cows were slaughtered, their skins went to the tanner's yard, they were dipped between a month and 3 months, they were pulled out, stretched out, and then with a big half moon raker, they scraped the hair off that. So it's a byproduct. So cow body hair predominantly, bovine hair is what we'd find in most of the ceilings, or most plasterwork walls or ceilings. So if you have got a crack, rather than trying to make it any wider, if it's a fine crack, I would, rather than putting a Stanley knife or a sharp knife through it, because that's just going to separate or cut the hairs. But if it has, if things are in good order, I would clean it back, put a hoover across the top of it, dampen it down as much as you can. And I'm not adverse to using soft modern day fillers.
Okay.
Toupee.
Yeah, I love that stuff. It's great. I've used that loads.
Yeah.
And I'm not a very good plaster, but you can sand it flat. It's great.
You can sand it flat. It remains quite flexible and soft. Whereas if you go with a traditional polyfiller, mix it with water and apply it, they go extremely hard. Probably too hard for the substrate it's on. So small, fine filling cracks with Toupee, I'm a big fan of, to be honest. Although not in a damp area. If it's cracked plasterwork on a masonry, stone, solid wall construction, if there's any signs of damp in there or any signs of damp on the wall, I'd probably go with a traditional lime putty and a very, very fine sand. The Toupee will break down if it's in constant moisture. But certainly for ceilings, I find it's very fine, it's very flexible, it can be sanded down by homeowners very successfully. Patching and repairing is probably the hardest work that we do, because if the light, if it's on a wall or on a ceiling, the light at a certain angle, if you've repaired a square foot or 2 square foot, or you're joining a piece of plasterwork where half of the wall has gone or half a ceiling has gone and blending it in. Blending joints in plasterwork is extremely tricky. Everyone wants an invisible repair. Ideally, you do the best job you can, and a repair is a repair. It should be seen as a repair. It's part of the history of the building. But yeah, there are certain times where you repair plasterwork on a stairwell and the sun comes down at 11 o'clock in the morning. You think, goodness me, what happened there? And then quarter of an hour has passed and the sun's moved and it looks as good as everyone would hope it would. We generally call the sun the light of truth. It shows up any imperfections.
But I guess when you're creating something that's intended on being incredibly smooth, and that's very difficult to, of course, blend it in and post, a bit like car body work, I suppose, that almost with car body work and you're doing that, actually you've got to take it back almost to the extremes to then give a finish over everything, and that's excessive often when it comes to plasterwork.
It is, and it's various clients. We work for clients that are more than happy for things to be patched and repaired in true conservation style, minimum intervention, which is wonderful. And they're very happy with the fact that they can see that's been patched as good as it is, but it's been blended in. Other homeowners, if they're patching and repairing, they want the whole wall over skimmed because they don't like the fact that it's got lumps and bumps in history. Yeah. It's very difficult to explain they've probably bought the wrong house.
Well,
without being rude.
When you've got cracks in ceilings, though, is there any merit in people just sort of gently having a push to see if it's actually debonded, if the ceiling's still actually sound and there's no give or what have you? Is that something you'd say to homeowners? Yes, you can do this yourself, or no, you shouldn't, because you don't want them to cause yet more damage. What's your view on people testing it for themselves in that way.
We've arrived to look at historic ceilings, flat or with ornamentation. And someone said, I'm quite happy if you poke it with a brush. We won't be doing that. No. So a simple push test to see if there is flex in it. Ideally, if it seems to be quite a bow, if you can very carefully have a look from behind. And that will let you know whether it's been nail rot, where the nails have rotted, the plaster's still hanging onto the laths, but in certain areas that's dropped away from the ceiling, or whether the laths are still in good order, but the keys have broken, and therefore there's areas of plaster hanging from the laths that have no keys attached to them and no hair and fibre binding it together. A simple push test to see if there's excessive flex in it, but that comes with experience, really.
I was going to say, it must come with experience knowing what you're feeling, whether you're feeling pushing laths or whether you're feeling just pushing plaster that's separated from the laths.
I've had an endoscope camera for a long time, and it arrived on Saturday with a 6-inch monitor, an 8mm bore, and it flexes 4 ways as well. That's a wonderful tool. If there are cracks or holes, you can push it up, or even down through floorboards. Sometimes we can have a look at the back of a ceiling by pushing it down through there, rather than the invasive of lifting floorboards. When you get into grade 2 star and grade 1, if you have to have a look at the back of a ceiling, we need planning permission to lift the floorboards. All parts of the building are, the historic fabric of the building. Simple push test is the way forward. Ideally, getting up on the level of the ceiling and to see if how bad the bow is. One of the first things we like to do is ask someone to walk across the ceiling while we're underneath it, and if we can see X amount of flex, in the joists, or we can see, God forbid, chandeliers wobbling if things have gone that soft, that's a good indication that the joists might have woodworm beetle infestation or something. That's why they've become weak and are now flexing more than they were when they were first installed. So asking someone to walk across the back of the ceiling, if that's possible. In a loft space it's not, but in a loft space you would like to think that you might be able to get up there carefully and have a look at the back of the ceiling that way. I don't recommend pushing it with a brush or a broom.
So, I mean, we get a lot of inquiries of people, certainly on the Facebook group and through the business, asking about repairing of a ceiling that has delaminated of some form. So 2 scenarios we're talking about: lath and plaster ceilings, both whether it's the laths that are let go, whether it's the plaster that's let go. Talk us through which is worse, or how we might be able to repair that from a kind of DIY or competent DIYer.
If the plaster is still very much bonded to the laths, the keys are in good order, there's plenty of hair in the mix, and it was the nail rot that we discussed where effectively the laths have broken away, that can be successfully. We'd never look to push it back. All we look to do is cradle with screws and washers, and the way we would go about that is to cut 25mm holes with a hole cutter, only in the plaster, not the laths. Ideally, find the laths and then find the gap between the laths, and then we can use stainless steel screws and washers to fix back up in the timber, just to cradle the laths. Like I say, we're not looking to try and push it back flat. That will snap it for sure. It might have taken 50, 80 or 100 years for the ceiling to settle in that position, and by trying to push it up, if there's any debris that's fallen down, which there will be, all you'll be doing is pushing it against the debris from behind. So screws and washers in that instance, very successful. If plaster has come away from the laths, if the keys have broken and it's detached, that's a bit more tricky, really. You need to, from above, clean and hoover any debris, clean out the remainder of what was the laths. Sometimes we can use a suspension system, which is cutting holes in the back of the plaster. But remember, you need a depth of plaster to do that. You can have stainless steel bars coming up, and on either the top of the joist if it's in an attic space, or in between the joists, you fix a steel, like a bat strap really, with the holes in it. You drop a threaded bar down. You can pour in resin into that hole and then finger tight nuts and bolts so it's in suspension. I wouldn't recommend that for a novice.
No, I was going to say,
really.
I was just thinking, I'm just working through in my head in terms of how to do that. I was thinking, I might leave that one for you, Sean, to be honest.
What you could do is try and cut some of the laths from above. You can dampen the plaster, and you can make small bridges with plaster from one side of a joist to another. So you're re-adhering plaster to plaster fixed into the side of the joist. You could almost put a screw eye, I think it would be. That's what we've used, into one side of the joist and on the other side, and then with a stainless steel wire taut between the two, dampen the plaster and then apply various plaster to that so effectively you're re-sticking it. Once again, you're never going to stick it back up, but these are sort of conservation techniques that have been practiced.
I was going to say, I mean, these are for sort of your grade 1, grade 2 star sort of type buildings, I suggest.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a non-listed property, but with a beautiful ceiling.
Yes, true.
Even flat plasterwork is still beautiful on its own. We would always try and save it as much as possible when customers saying, well, we're taking all the lard and plaster ceilings out because they've got cracks in them.
I know.
But yeah, but they're quite firm. They don't need to come out.
Yeah.
Well, can they be over skimmed? Ideally, no. They could be rubbed down. They could be redecorated with soft distempers, which in itself covers a lot of imperfections. So yeah, we can salvage a lot and conserve a lot, basically. They are sort of quite practiced techniques. There's online, people have a look online and see someone do it and have a go. But before you start any of the work from above, ideally the area that might be bowing or failing, we would soft prop it from below. So that's not to push it back up. That's to cradle it as it is, build a table or a platform about 3 inches lower than the ceiling, and then push in lambswool insulation. Anything that you might be reusing insulation-wise in the future, use that just to cradle it. So as when you do go up above, there's a little bit of support there. But by all means, don't try and push the thing back up. You'll end up losing it and breaking it.
One of the causes I've found over the years of nibs failing, my experience has nearly always been some form of water causing the lath to distort and warp or what have you. And then that's obviously broken the nib because of that movement. So water leaks. What other problems have you come across that have caused nibs to fail? I mean, you mentioned joists that may have got a bit wormy and therefore got a bit of movement. So clearly that's an issue. I mean, another thing I've come across is overloading. People put too many books on upper floors and don't realise how heavy books can be. And things like that. What sort of things have you found that have caused problems to ceilings that are actually would be fairly simple fixes if people only thought about it?
Poor workmanship by other trades. I'm not going to name them. They know who they are. But when they're lifting floorboards, M&E, plumbing, electrics and the like, cutting through joists, breaking nibs, debris left on the back of the ceiling. And I'm certainly not tarring everyone with the same brush. There are some fantastic tradesmen out there who know how to use a hoover and carry on. But unfortunately, history shows us when you find an empty weights packet, weights cigarettes back in the day, or Capstan Full Strength or whatever they were, the history of the building, cleaning out the back of ceilings is phenomenal. The things that you find, we've never found anything of great value. Yeah, the keys and the nibs have been broken by others lifting floorboards and running pipes and cables, or sort of structural repairs. If someone's decided the ceiling or the floor joist a bit weak, so they've tried to strengthen them. We had a project locally, actually. They'd been told that joists needed sistering from either side. Tradesmen, in their mind, did a thorough job. So along each of the joists, they broke off all the keys in 2-inch strips, so as they could fix their 8x2s nice and close to the ceiling. One of the projects on the website, actually, Regency House it's called, that was a beautiful ceiling centre that collapsed. And when we got to have a look at the situation, the laths were in good order, the plaster was in good order, but in a 4-foot square in the centre of the ceiling, a little bit of bounce, but they literally cleaned off all the keys either side. In fairness, so as they could get the joists.
An excellent carpentry job, isn't it? Lining the two
joists
up.
It was. I can't knock their enthusiasm for wanting to do as good a job as possible.
Yeah.
Had someone with a bit of experience looked at it and thought, actually, the 6x2s, the 6x2s would be fine. They're going to do the same job. They don't need to be. The laths, the plasterwork, are going to be in order. So poor workmanship new bathrooms going in Victorian houses, bathrooms, they're pulling up floorboards and some of the debris goes on the back. It shouldn't be there. It's just adding weight to the back of the ceiling that doesn't need to be there. Obviously, as you've mentioned, water, but the beauty of lime, it dries out. If it was a plasterboard ceiling that had been soaked for 6 hours from a leak, there's every chance that's going to dry out. If it was plasterboard soaked for 6 hours, it will be on the floor in short order.
But I remember when I was stripping some wallpaper and using a steamer, and I remember being told, put that away because that can fracture the nibs off. Is there any truth in that? Or
No, the only thing that will fracture nibs is by hard physical scraping. The actual steam, what you can do if you're not careful, you can waterlog the plaster. If we're putting plaster back, flat plasterwork, we allow 32 kilos per square metre for 3 coats.
That's quite some weight, goodness.
It is, but that's wet. So obviously when it dries, when the water comes out, it's I would imagine a third of the weight would be water. So if you are steaming a ceiling or walls of an age and you introduce, if you hold the steamer there too long and it's absorbing, the water, the steam that's going to get into that is going to
a lot of weight.
It's going to bring it back to a weight. And if it's a ceiling of an age with tired laths and other pieces, that could cause it. It's generally the vigorous scraping of the paint that is likely to break the nibs. Cleaning historic plasterwork, whether it's flat plasterwork or ornamental, we would always try and start with steam, warm water. Failing that, we would then move on to chemical poultices, always doing a trial sample first.
So Sean, we're talking about the repair of issues with ceilings, and in previous episodes we've talked about the myriad of different limes that are out there, from natural hydraulic limes, non-hydraulic limes, composite mixes, air limes, etc., etc. How do you select which is the correct lime to use when you're doing a repair to a ceiling?
We would always try and, if we're repairing a ceiling, a small patch or a crack, we would always try and match the mortar as close as possible. Earth ceilings, we would go with earth and fine lime finishing coats generally. Lime plaster ceilings, generally speaking, of an age, would be lime putty and sand, coarse sand for the backing coats and a fine finishing coat. When you get up into the attic spaces of prestigious buildings, and when you get into small cottages, it's not always a traditional 3-coat system of a pricking up coat or a scratch coat and then a float coat. Quite often in those sort of attic spaces or in vernacular buildings, it would be called a coat and a half. So they would apply 1 coat onto a ceiling if it was laths, and then whilst it was still quite green, they would apply another coat and even it out and smooth it out as best they could. So you might still see the laths grinning through. So not all fabulous buildings have fabulous plasterwork all over. But ideally, you would try and match the mortar like for like. And if you are patching, repairing, there's bound to be a piece on the floor. You can break it up, pestle and mortar styly, or if it's quite soft, just break it up in your hand and see the size of the aggregate. The fine finishing coats are always going to be a very fine sand, millimetre down, whereas the backing coats could be 6 mil down, 5 mil down, quite coarse. And the backing coats, the coarser the mix, the less shrinkage you're going to have, and the animal hair and fibres that you would need to add to those backing coats. Early English plasterwork, the finishing coats, they used to apply putty, sometimes aggregate, but it would have fine chopped hair in it, fine white goat hair or fine hair, because that would lay down nicely with the trowel, whereas the coarse cow body hair won't lay down with the trowel. It's perfectly acceptable in the backing coats. It rubs down with a float, but not in the fine finishing coats. But when it comes to patching and repairing, always try and break a piece of mortar down and work out what it is you're working with. Other parts of the country, you'll have chalk plasters. Like I say, down in Devon, we don't have any chalk plasters. It's lime or earth. Historically, in the fens and the like, you will get sort of chalk plasters, which are far more adaptable to the materials they're working with on the laths or whatever. Great recipes from them. So have a look at what you've got and try and match it as close as possible. You can either do that yourself. If you're very keen, you could go to all the builders merchants and try and track down a good sand, or go to one of your lime suppliers with a sample, and they're going to have a library of sands that they can best match to yours. Whilst if you're external rendering, you want a good clean sand that will float up nicely, very few fines and impurities, no chance or very small chance of shrinkage and cracking. But when it comes to lath and plaster work and ceilings, as we've mentioned many times, earth ceilings, you'll struggle to find anything dirtier to apply as a backing coat. And yet it works very, very well. It's soft, flexible, which works well on laths. You wouldn't necessarily want hard, sharp, washed sand on laths. So choosing your material, just go like for like would be my advice. Take a piece off, have a look at it. If you're not experienced, send it to one of the lime companies and they'll be able to tell you what the sand is.
And with a lime, you mentioned putty. Is there a place, or is there ever a need for doing it hot, for having hot mix plasters? Is that a thing?
It is. We've used hot mix earth mortars on repairing lath and plaster ceilings or walls. It's not all lath and plaster. We do work on masonry walls as well. And we know it's a hot mix because you can take a piece off, you can look at it and you'll see the small lime inclusions, little white chips of lime that show predominantly that would have been a hot mix as opposed to a pure putty and aggregate mix. But we do have to be careful with hot mixing. We would tend to use hot mixing. We'd mix it hot and we would let it cool down 2 or 3 days, put it through a forced action mixer, add a little bit of water if it's needed, and then apply it. What you don't want is to apply a hot mix onto laths that hasn't had enough water to quench the slaking because it will still expand. So practice, that comes into practice, really. But hot mixes have been used, certainly through history, on historic buildings, on backing coats, not so much fine finishing coats.
What about hydrated or bagged lime?
I have used hydrate lime. It was fresh. It was in good order. I slaked it into a putty over 3 days, I think it was, drained off the rest of the water, and I have mixed that with casting plaster and run cornices successfully with it. We knew it was fresh, the hydrate lime. The difficulty with buying hydrate lime is, unless you're experienced or ask enough questions, it might have been sat there for a couple of months or more. And by doing that, even though it's in paper bags, it can start to absorb moisture. Whilst it's still going to be a powder, it's not going to give you a great product. But we have used fresh hydrate lime for running ornamental cornice or running mouldings in situ. The small experiment that I did with a mature lime putty and a hydrate lime powder that I slaked into a putty. So there's no exothermic reaction with that. It's just a case of adding it to water. It was probably a week old or a month. It was of an age. It'd been there a while. And with a clean gauging trowel, I dipped it into the hydrate mix, if you like, the putty that had come from the hydrate, and pulled it out. And whilst there was a staining of putty, I then wiped it off, dried it, and then I did the same in the mature lime putty, minimum of 4 months, and pulled it out. And it actively bites onto the trowel. It leaves putty on there, as opposed to the hydrate putty mix, it works well. It does work well, not had any issues with it. But lime putty is very available. So we always make sure we've got plenty of lime putty.
Can I ask you some things that will probably make you shudder? But I'd like your reaction on these. So first of all, one of the sort of repairs I've come across in the past is where someone has had a bit of a failure. So they cut out the lath and plaster and shoved a bit of plasterboard up and just skimmed over that.
I've done that.
If it's confession time, yeah, been there.
So would you say, I mean, and bearing in mind, we might be talking about a non-listed late Victorian Edwardian building, something like that. Would you say that's an absolute no-no, or is it a valid method of repair in certain circumstances?
Certain circumstances, I wouldn't be offended. Ideally, you'd always want to go back. What we quite often find is the laths are still there. So what they've done is cut plasterboard, fixed it over the top of the laths, and then patched it up. In that respect, it's reversible. You can take the plasterboard down, the laths are still there, you haven't got to start cutting back to other joists. It's not ideal. You're going to have the movement between traditional lath and plaster and the edges of plasterboard. Whilst I'm not going to condone it on some fabulous buildings, we've also seen it. There are certain times we would like to think that all the jobs that we work on, if we're repairing historic ceilings, that we've got as much time in the world to go and do a wonderful job, to apply a pricking up coat, leave it for 2 or 3 weeks, then come back with a floating coat, finishing coat, ornamentation, whatever we're doing. That doesn't work in a dentist surgery. You've got to get it back up and running as soon as possible. You've got to be realistic. There are ways of speeding up the time of the backing coats. If it's on lath and plaster work, we can add casting plaster to the backing coats, which will make it set. It won't carbonate. It's not carbonating, but it's setting. I wouldn't do that anywhere near a masonry wall because any moisture coming through that will break down the gypsum. Casting plaster of Paris is just a gypsum. On certain patches on ceilings, we have sped up the process by using casting plaster in the haired core stuff in the backing coats so as we can move things along. The only thing to remember, by adding the casting plaster, it makes it stronger and a bit more brittle. So it's going to be a harder patch, but it doesn't take a lot of casting plaster to enable you to move things along.
Next horror then, overboarding with plasterboard. Now this is not where you've got a cornice or anything behind, but you've got a lath and plaster ceiling that has perhaps started to fail. We talked earlier about whether it's plaster coming away from laths or the laths coming away from the joists or what have you. But someone has come along and decided to sandwich that and just overboard it with plasterboard. Good or bad, or it has its purpose at times.
It has its purpose, I think. Certainly in the early days when we were working on Victorian houses that were being converted from a big Victorian house into 3 apartments. The accepted building regs at the time were to over plasterboard the lath and plaster ceilings for fire regs. The lath and plaster is still there. It is reversible. It's not going to be easy, but you can take the plasterboard off. You've still got the lath and plaster there, albeit it's going to have lots of screw holes in it and it might have weakened it. There is a time and a place. I don't recommend it, but it has been used and proven in the past. And there are still some of the buildings we worked on 40 years ago. They've still got their lath and plaster ceilings, but they're encased in a plasterboard. The purists are probably falling off their chairs or falling asleep at this point, I don't know, and would be horrified. It's reversible. It's more of a shame when they rip the lath and plaster down and then plasterboard it, because that's the fabric gone, and once it's gone, it's gone.
Well, confession time here. I've where it's been a very plain ceiling in a non-listed but older building, I've actually recommended overboarding with ceilings that have started to deteriorate. Because it's less mess as well. If someone is going to pull down a lath and plaster ceiling, think of the mess that it's going to create. Far easier just to overboard it. And if someone then at a later date can take that down and reinstate the lath and plaster properly, much better in my view. So I actually have recommended it at times. But yeah,
less confession.
That's my
but
confession for the evening.
Well, less confession. But before my time, I've got 3 rooms in a line here upstairs, and 2 of the bedroom ceilings, they beautifully kick up at the ends, close to the exterior walls where the original lath and plaster ceilings. But the room in the middle has been overboarded and it's absolutely perfectly flat and it looks wrong. It looks really weird because there's no character to it whatsoever. And I think it's a huge shame and it's been overboarded. And I'd love to be able to take that down and from above there is the lath and plaster still there, so they have just overboarded it because they couldn't see from the ceiling. But it's just one of those jobs that's just like, well, I'm not gonna take that one on just yet.
No. Like I say, I think there is a time and a place. And if the historic fabric of the building is still there, that's a good thing. And, when someone gets a bit more time and a bit more money, they might choose to take the plasterboard off and get it repaired. So, yeah, I wouldn't lose too much sleep over that one.
I think, seeing as we're in confession zone, I think that's a good time to perhaps wrap up this particular episode. We're going to carry on talking to Sean about various other things, but I think for now, finishing on our confessions would be a good place, and we'd like you to keep listening. So like and subscribe to the channel as we always ask you to do. But what we'd like you to then do is watch the next episode, because in the next episode, we're going to start digging deeper into Sean's expertise on the fine plasterwork, the decorative plasterwork. So listen out for that one, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode. Thank you. You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.